Tonight, we're going back to the longest night the Earth has ever known. 66 million years ago, the age of dinosaurs came to an end. You've heard that story, the asteroid, the impact, the fire and dust. But what came after was something quieter and in some ways stranger. The sun disappeared, not for a day, not for a week, but for months. Dust and ash filled the sky so thickly that plants couldn't grow. The food chains that had held steady for millions of years began to collapse, link by link in the darkness. Most dinosaurs didn't survive. Most large animals didn't survive. The world that emerged on the other side was emptier than it had been in over 100 million years. But not everything vanished. Somewhere in that long darkness, small creatures were still breathing, and among them were birds, the only dinosaurs who would ever see the sun again. Scientists have spent decades asking why. Why birds? Why not the others? What made the difference between a lineage that disappeared and one that held on? Tonight, we'll sit with that question. We'll look at what the fossils tell us about those dark months and what kinds of bodies and behaviors might have carried a small feathered creature through to the other side. But before we begin, if you're already enjoying this peaceful moment, it would mean the world to me if you gave this video a like, maybe even subscribed if you'd like more sleepy science stories like this. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight and what time is it there? I love watching our little bedtime map light up, one dreamer at a time. So now take a deep breath, let your shoulders loosen, and together let's follow the small wings that made it through Earth's longest night. Long before the quiet creatures began their patient endurance, long before darkness settled into months instead of hours, something ancient and silent crossed Earth's orbit. It had been traveling through the solar system for unimaginable spans of time, a remnant from the earliest age of planetary formation, cold and unfeeling, carrying no awareness of the world it was about to meet. When it finally struck, it did not arrive like a storm that builds or a fire that spreads. It arrived as an instant. The body itself was immense, wider than any mountain range familiar to life at the time, moving faster than any natural force Earth's surface had ever endured. Its speed turned mass into violence, and that violence into energy, so vast that it rewrote the rules by which extinction usually unfolds. The point of impact was shallow sea, but the difference between land and water meant nothing at that scale. In the fraction of a moment when it made contact, the crust behaved less like solid stone and more like liquid, rebounding and rupturing as energy rippled outward through the planet itself. The heat released exceeded anything produced by Earth's internal systems, hotter than volcanic chambers, hotter than surface rock had ever become, not as a flame, but as a brief blinding transformation of matter. Scientists today reconstruct this moment from scars left behind, shocked minerals that remember pressure long after the shock has passed, layers of debris that appear all at once in the geological record, whispering that something profoundly different happened here. This was not the kind of extinction pressure life had adapted to across deep time. Volcanic winters had come before, seas had risen and fallen, continents had shifted slowly enough for ecosystems to bend and migrate. Even rapid climate swings usually moved in steps, giving life moments, however small, to respond. This impact offered no such allowance. The speed and angle of collision launched vast quantities of pulverized rock, sulfur and carbon high into the atmosphere, far beyond ordinary weather, far beyond the reach of rain. Material that had once rested quietly beneath shallow seas was thrown upward into sunlight and then spread around the globe by high-altitude winds, circling the planet again and again. At the same time, the energy released did not stay confined to the impact zone. It traveled through Earth's crust as seismic waves, igniting fires far beyond the horizon, shaking landscapes that would never see the crater itself. Oceans absorbed shock and answered back with enormous waves, rearranging coastlines and continental shelves in hours. This was not simply destruction at a single place, but a cascading response from a living planet pushed far outside its normal balance. The key difference lay not only in how much energy was released, but in how quickly it arrived. Life was forced from stability into chaos, with no transition, no gradual slide, no warning written into seasons or migrations. In the immediate aftermath, Earth entered a condition it had never experienced in its long history as a living world. The atmosphere became a carrier of harm instead of shelter, thickened with debris that turned daylight into dim memory. Chemical reactions triggered by the impact altered rainfall itself, so that even distant regions felt the event without ever seeing its source. The oceans, already struck by shock and displacement, began absorbing changed chemistry from the skies above them. On land, heat from falling debris arrived not as a single wall of flame, but as countless ignitions, scattered and nearly simultaneous, overwhelming forests and turning stored carbon into airborne soot. These effects unfolded rapidly, but not as a single ending. They layered atop one another, interacting in ways no ecosystem had evolved to withstand. Scientists understand this now, not by imagining the moment alone, but by tracing its echoes, reading the planet's memory preserved in rock and fossil and chemical trace. What emerges is a portrait of a catastrophe that was neither local nor brief, neither simple nor isolated. It was an event that forced Earth into a new state, one where the familiar patterns that had governed survival for millions of years no longer applied, and where persistence depended not on strength, dominance, or complexity, but on something quieter and far more fragile. In the moments that followed the collision, before the planet had time to settle into darkness or chemical change, Earth reacted like a struck instrument, sending vibrations through every layer of its body. The crust, normally rigid and patient, shuddered as shock waves raced outward from the point of impact, not slowly, but at speeds that ignored borders and oceans. Rock fractured far beyond the crater itself, fault lines slipped in places untouched for millions of years, and the ground trembled across continents that would never know why. These were not localized earthquakes, not events that rose and faded along a single fault, but a global ringing, as if the planet itself had been briefly unbalanced. In some regions, stone formations collapsed instantly. In others, the shaking arrived minutes later, a delayed reminder carried through the deep interior. Beneath the oceans, the seafloor flexed and rebounded, sending pressure upward through water that had nowhere to escape. What life remained in those first moments felt a world no longer solid beneath it, a surface that could not be trusted to stay still. The air above shook as well, pushed outward by energy that had nowhere else to go, flattening landscapes close to the impact and disturbing skies far beyond the horizon. This was Earth responding mechanically, not emotionally, following the laws of physics written into its structure, translating collision into movement, movement into collapse. As the crust convulsed, the oceans answered in a different language, one written in motion and scale rather than stone. Vast volumes of water were displaced almost instantly, lifted and hurled outward by the force below. The first waves near the impact zone rose higher than any coastal life had ever encountered, towering walls of moving sea that erased shorelines and surged inland before retreating just as violently. But the true reach of these waves revealed itself over time as they crossed entire ocean basins, spreading and reshaping themselves as they traveled. What began as vertical displacement became long, fast-moving pulses, racing across open water with quiet persistence. Hours later, distant coasts would feel the arrival not as a single crash, but as repeated surges, water rising and falling in rhythms no tide had taught. Continental shelves were scoured clean, shallow ecosystems torn apart and carried away, sediments lifted and redeposited in unfamiliar places. The oceans, which had once offered stability through their depth and vastness, became conduits, carrying the memory of impact to lands untouched by fire or shaking. In these moments, the separation between sea and land dissolved, replaced by a single connected system responding to the same sudden force. Above it all, the sky itself became an agent of destruction. Material blasted upward during impact began its return almost immediately, fragments heated by passage through air, glowing briefly before raining back across the planet. This was not a single curtain of flame, but countless falling embers spread over immense distances. Wherever they landed, dry vegetation ignited, not gradually, but nearly at once, as if a signal had been given. Fires erupted in forests, thousands of miles from the crater, separated by oceans and time zones, joined only by the thin layer of atmosphere carrying heat back downward. These fires did not burn as ordinary wildfires do, creeping and selecting, but overwhelmed landscapes already shaken and disoriented. Smoke rose to join ash and dust already accumulating above, further thickening the skies that would soon deny sunlight altogether. In this early phase, destruction was swift and widespread, but uneven, striking some regions with fire, others with water, others with trembling ground. Life experienced the catastrophe not as a single moment, but as overlapping forces arriving in rapid succession, each stripping away another layer of the familiar world. And as minutes stretched into hours, Earth moved inexorably from violence into aftermath, carrying the consequences of those first motions forward into a much longer, quieter struggle that had only just begun. After the ground had finished shaking and the oceans had carried their shock across the planet, the disaster rose upward, leaving the surface behind and claiming the sky itself. Material blasted free by the impact did not simply arc and fall nearby. It was carried far above weather and clouds, beyond the gentle cycling of rain and wind, into the thin upper reaches of the atmosphere where the earth holds heat loosely. There, pulverized rock, droplets of molten stone, and fine mineral dust spread outward in expanding rings, circling the planet as the world continued to turn beneath them. What had once been seabed and crust was briefly suspended above everything alive, not as a single mass, but as an invisible veil forming overhead. In this high, cold region, motion replaced meaning. Particles collided and dispersed. Sunlight struck them from above, while the surface waited below, unaware of what was assembling. The sky, which had always filtered light and moderated heat, now became a storage space for energy and destruction, holding it just long enough to ensure that no corner of the world would be spared its return. As this material began to descend, gravity reclaimed it piece by piece, transforming invisible debris into a planetary phenomenon. The return was not gentle. Tiny fragments heated as they tore back through denser air, glowing briefly before cooling again, while larger droplets of molten rock fell faster, retaining enough heat to ignite whatever they touched. This was not a single curtain of flame, not a moving front that could be outrun or anticipated. It was a dispersed, almost simultaneous event, scattered across continents and oceans alike. Wherever dry vegetation existed, ignition followed. Forests that had grown in isolation for millions of years began burning within the same narrow window of time, connected not by proximity but by atmosphere. In regions already shaken and scarred by earlier forces, these fires found landscapes unable to resist them. Canopies ignited from above, leaf litter flared instantly, and the accumulated carbon of ancient ecosystems was released back into the air in thick, rising smoke. The fires fed not only on trees, but on undergrowth, peat, and soils rich with organic matter, burning deeper and longer than ordinary wildfires ever could. The near simultaneity of this burning was not coincidence, but consequence. The rain of heat arrived from above, rather than spreading outward from sparks on the ground, bypassing the usual barriers that slow fires advance. Rivers, clearings, and terrain offered little protection when ignition came from the sky itself. Even regions far removed from the impact zone experienced this phase, united by shared atmosphere rather than shared geography. As forests burned, smoke and soot rose quickly, joining dust already present at altitude, thickening the layer that now wrapped the planet. This combined shroud altered how light moved through the air, scattering it, absorbing it, dimming the day long before true darkness settled in. In this way, the fires were not only an outcome of the catastrophe, but an amplifier, adding their own contribution to the growing obstruction between the sun and the surface. The skies ceased to be a passive backdrop and became an active force, delivering heat, spreading fire, and then trapping the byproducts of destruction where they could do the most lasting work. Beneath this transformed sky, life encountered a world where the usual signals no longer aligned. Daylight arrived muted and unreliable, carrying the smell of smoke even far from burning forests. Ash fell softly in some places, coating leaves and water with fine gray film, while in others it drifted unseen, suspended above, waiting. The atmosphere, once a cushion that softened extremes, now prolonged them, holding heat briefly during re-entry, and then guarding cold by blocking the sun that followed. This dual role marked a turning point. The violence of the impact had passed, but its influence had not. Through the altered sky, the event reached forward in time, ensuring that the damage would continue long after flames died down and ground cooled. In that altered light and thickened air, the world slipped further away from its old rhythms, not with another sudden blow, but with a quiet persistence that settled over everything alive, carried on the breath of a planet whose sky had turned against it. After fire had written its mark across continents and ash had joined debris already suspended high above the surface, the planet entered a phase defined not by motion, but by absence. Light, which had always returned each morning without fail, became thin and unreliable, filtered through layers of soot and mineral dust that wrapped the earth in a dim, uneven shroud. The sun still rose, but its warmth no longer reached the ground with strength or clarity. Days took on the muted quality of deep twilight, stretched across weeks and then months, as particles continued to circle the globe rather than falling away. Rain could not easily wash them out because much of this material resided far above ordinary weather, lingering where winds were slow and cycles were long. In many places, skies remained colorless and flat, neither fully dark nor truly bright, a world illuminated without warmth. Plants, rooted and unable to move, encountered a problem no previous cooling or drought had prepared them for. Photosynthesis, the quiet chemical conversation between leaf and light, faltered almost everywhere at once. With energy intake reduced to a fraction of normal levels, growth slowed, then stopped. Leaves yellowed and dropped, stems softened, and vast stretches of vegetation entered a state of suspended decline rather than dramatic death. Even hardy species adapted to shade could not function indefinitely under such conditions, because the issue was not darkness alone, but duration. The light that filtered down carried too little energy to support the invisible machinery that turned sunlight into food. As plants failed, the effect moved outward through ecosystems like a tide, pulling quietly back from shore. Food webs that had evolved complexity over tens of millions of years depended on constant primary production, not just on occasional abundance. When that production collapsed, the loss did not announce itself immediately. Seeds still existed, roots retained stored sugars, and some organisms fed on detritus rather than fresh growth. But as weeks accumulated into months, reserves dwindled. Herbivores faced landscapes that looked intact from a distance, but offered little nourishment upon closer contact. Predators, removed yet another step from the source of energy, encountered prey that was weaker, rarer, and less predictable. The darkness lasted long enough to outlast most short-term survival strategies, but not so long that every form of life vanished. Geological and chemical evidence suggests this low light interval endured for many months and possibly several years in its most intense form, easing gradually rather than ending sharply. During this time, seasons lost meaning. Temperature remained unstable, and growth cycles that relied on timing could not synchronize. This prolonged dimming mattered more than the moment of impact itself, because it transformed a sudden catastrophe into a sustained ecological trial. The collision initiated destruction, but the loss of sunlight maintained it, extending stress across generations rather than moments. It did not matter how fast an animal could run or how large it was if the world no longer produced enough energy to sustain complex bodies. Survival narrowed toward those forms of life that required little, could wait patiently, or could draw nourishment from sources less dependent on fresh plant growth. In this altered light, Earth did not simply recover from a blow. It learned, slowly and unevenly, what could persist when the most basic input to life was withheld. The collapse of sunlight reshaped the rules of existence, selecting not for dominance or reach, but for endurance within a quieter, dimmer world where waiting became as important as action. As the dim months stretched onward and sunlight remained weak and unreliable, the world began to change in ways that were quieter than fire or flood, but far more decisive. Life's deepest structures are built around energy moving upward from the ground, from leaf to muscle to motion, and when that upward flow slowed, the consequences rippled through ecosystems with a heavy patience. Plants, already struggling under low light, were the first to falter beyond recovery. Without enough energy to maintain growth or repair, many entered a prolonged decline, shedding leaves to conserve what little they had stored, reducing themselves to stems and roots, waiting for conditions that did not return in time. Forests that had once held dense canopies thinned into skeletal forms, and grasslands lost their ability to replace what grazing removed. Even hardy plants adapted to cold or shade could not sustain themselves indefinitely without sufficient light, and as months accumulated, death overtook dormancy. The change was not dramatic from one day to the next, but gradual and everywhere at once, a slow retreat of green from the surface of the planet. With plant life failing, the foundation of terrestrial food systems weakened beyond repair, leaving behind landscapes that appeared familiar in shape but empty in function. Herbivores were next to feel this absence, though not immediately. Many large plant eaters were built for abundance, carrying massive digestive systems designed to process vast amounts of low-quality vegetation. In normal times, this made them remarkably efficient. In a world where new growth had nearly ceased, it became a trap. As forage declined, these animals were forced to travel farther for food that offered less nourishment with each passing season. Juveniles struggled to reach maturity, pregnant adults failed to sustain developing offspring, and herds thinned not through sudden die-offs, but through steady attrition. Smaller herbivores faced similar challenges, but some could turn to seeds, bark, or underground stores, drawing from reserves accumulated before the collapse. For larger forms, energy demands scaled too steeply. Their bodies, once an advantage in competition and defense, now required levels of intake the land could no longer provide. Starvation unfolded as a drawn-out process, marked by weakened movement and reduced reproduction long before death arrived. The land grew quieter, not from absence of life entirely, but from the loss of those animals that had once shaped it through sheer presence. Carnivores, removed yet another step from the source of energy, experienced a delayed reckoning. At first, the abundance of weakened prey may have seemed like opportunity. Predators fed on the remnants of collapsing herbivore populations, scavenging as much as hunting, stretching meals across longer intervals. But this apparent buffer was brief. As prey numbers continued to fall, competition among carnivores intensified, territories expanded unsustainably, and energy budgets failed. Large predators, built for bursts of power and high metabolic output, found themselves unable to balance the cost of movement with the shrinking return of each hunt. Smaller carnivores fared slightly better, able to shift towards scavenging or consume a wider range of organisms, but even they were constrained by the broader collapse of food webs. Eventually, predator populations followed herbivores into decline, not because they lacked skill or strength, but because the system that supported them had unraveled from below. The sequence of loss moved predictably upward, from plants to plant eaters to hunters, illustrating that in a world without steady energy input, complexity became vulnerability. Throughout this progression, size emerged as one of the most consistent liabilities. Large bodies require continuous intake, not just to move, but to stay warm, maintain tissue, and reproduce. In times of plenty, this cost is easily met. In prolonged scarcity, it becomes unsustainable. Smaller organisms, with lower absolute needs and greater flexibility, could survive on scraps, stored reserves, or intermittent feeding. They could shelter, wait, and endure. The collapse of food did not reward dominance or adaptation to peak conditions, but persistence under deprivation. Earth's biosphere, once shaped by towering forms and intricate hierarchies, contracted into something leaner and quieter, carrying forward only what could live on very little, move with restraint, and accept a world where nourishment arrived slowly, if at all. While the land endured hunger beneath dim skies, the oceans, vast and seemingly resilient, entered a crisis that was quieter but just as severe. Rain continued to fall during those darkened months, but it carried a new chemistry shaped by smoke, sulfur, and fine particles suspended high above. When this rain reached the sea, it subtly altered the surface waters, shifting their balance toward acidity in ways that spread far beyond the coasts. The change did not announce itself with dramatic waves or visible destruction. It arrived gently, drop by drop, dissolving into currents and sinking slowly through layers of water that had remained chemically stable for millions of years. Near the surface, where sunlight had once powered the ocean's food system, the combined loss of light and chemical stability proved devastating. Plankton, the drifting foundation of marine life, rely on a narrow window of conditions to survive. With sunlight reduced and surface waters altered, many species struggled to grow or reproduce. Their populations thinned rapidly, not because of a single lethal moment, but because each new generation failed to replace the last. As plankton declined, the clarity of the water changed, organic matter sank unused, and the steady transfer of energy from surface to depth weakened. The sea, which had always moved nutrients in cycles, began to feel stalled, its surface alive with particles but lacking the quiet productivity that had once sustained entire food webs. Reef systems, already sensitive to changes in temperature and chemistry, suffered even more dramatically. Built slowly by countless generations of tiny organisms, reefs depend on stable conditions to maintain their intricate structures. As acidity increased, the ability of reef builders to maintain their skeletons diminished, leaving these ecosystems brittle and vulnerable. Growth slowed, erosion accelerated, and the complex architecture that sheltered thousands of species began to crumble. Fish that depended on reefs for protection or feeding found fewer places to hide, fewer resources to rely on, and greater exposure to predators in an increasingly simplified seascape. In deeper waters, the effects arrived more slowly, buffered by distance from the surface, but even there, the consequences of surface collapse eventually filtered down. With plankton scarce, fewer nutrients reached the depths, and food chains that extended from surface to seabed began to break. Large marine animals, like their counterparts on land, faced shortages that reduced reproduction and survival over time. Some species disappeared entirely from the fossil record, while others persisted only in reduced forms, confined to narrower ecological margins. The oceans, which had once offered continuity when land environments shifted, could not escape the reach of a planetary crisis that altered chemistry, light, and energy flow all at once. What made this marine collapse so profound was its scope. Nearly every ocean basin was affected, not by direct impact or fire, but by interconnected changes that left no refuge untouched. Marine ecosystems rely on stability over vast scales, and when that stability vanished, the systems unraveled from their most delicate foundations upward. Without abundant plankton, there could be no lasting recovery for higher levels of the food web. Without reefs, coastal complexity gave way to open, less productive waters. The disappearance of these systems reshaped the oceans into a simpler, leaner world, one where survival favored small size, low energy needs, and the ability to endure long periods of scarcity. The near vanishing of marine ecosystems was not sudden or loud, but persistent and far reaching, unfolding over years as conditions failed to improve. In this altered sea, life did not flourish or diversify. It endured, holding on in pockets and remnants, waiting for a slow return of light and balance. The oceans became mirrors of the land above, reflecting a planet stripped down to its most patient forms, carrying forward only what could persist through quiet, prolonged loss. As ash and aerosols continued to veil the sky and food systems strained under scarcity, the planet's temperature began to swing in ways that felt disorienting even to systems accustomed to change. The first shift moved toward cold. With sunlight weakened and scattered, the surface lost more heat than it gained, and global temperatures fell rapidly. Frost reached into regions that had rarely known it, and seasonal boundaries blurred into long stretches of chill. Bodies accustomed to warmth conserved energy by slowing, reducing movement, and retreating into shelter where possible. In the oceans, surface waters cooled and mixed differently, disrupting currents that once moved heat gently across basins. This cooling phase did not arrive evenly, but it arrived broadly, touching almost every ecosystem at once, tightening margins that were already thin. Then, slowly, as dust settled and sunlight began its careful return, another shift followed, one less intuitive and just as stressful. Gases released during impact, fires, and the long collapse of vegetation lingered in the atmosphere, trapping heat that would otherwise escape into space. As skies cleared, the planet did not simply return to its former balance. Instead, temperatures climbed, sometimes sharply, producing greenhouse conditions that stood in stark contrast to the cold that preceded them. Regions that had just endured prolonged chill now faced warmth and humidity that altered soils, water availability, and remaining plant life. The sequence mattered as much as the extremes themselves. Organisms were forced to adapt not just to cold or heat, but to rapid reversal, to a world where familiar signals no longer lined up with expectations written into their biology. This whiplash between temperature states placed a unique burden on life, especially on larger and more specialized forms. Adaptation often depends on predictability, on the slow unfolding of conditions that allow bodies and behaviors to track change across generations. Here, change arrived faster than such adjustments could stabilize. Cold selected for insulation and energy conservation, while sudden warmth favored heat dissipation and tolerance, pulling survival in opposing directions within short spans of time. Many organisms could tolerate one extreme reasonably well, but few could endure both without cost. Shelters that protected against cold became traps during warming, and metabolic strategies that conserved energy under scarcity struggled under heat. In ecosystems already stripped of redundancy by earlier losses, these pressures compounded. Stability, more than absolute toughness, became the rarest and most valuable condition. Smaller organisms with flexible physiology and modest energy needs were better able to ride these swings, adjusting activity levels rather than remaking their bodies entirely. Burrowing, dormancy, and simple behavioral shifts offered buffers that raw strength never could. The planet itself seemed restless, testing life not with a single challenge, but with uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. Through this period, survival favored those forms of life that could endure inconsistency without breaking, that could remain functional across a wide range of conditions without depending on precise balance. Temperature whiplash did not announce a new era of abundance or recovery. It prolonged instability, stretching the aftermath across years and generations, quietly shaping which lineages would remain when the world finally slowed enough to settle again. By the time the planet had settled into its unstable rhythms of dim light, shifting temperatures, and scarce food, the most dramatic moments of the catastrophe were already far behind it. The fire had burned, the waves had passed, the sky had changed, yet extinction itself did not arrive as a single closing door. Instead, it unfolded slowly, unevenly, stretched across years that felt endless to the living world trying to adapt. Many organisms survived the initial violence simply because they were sheltered, distant, or small enough to be missed by the worst forces. These survivors did not step into safety. They stepped into a landscape stripped of reliability, where every day required adjustment to conditions that refused to stabilize. Fossils preserve this truth quietly. They show not an abrupt disappearance of all life at once, but a thinning over time, a gradual loss of diversity as lineages failed to reproduce, populations shrank, and local extinctions accumulated into something global. The planet did not become silent in an instant. It grew quieter year by year as voices faded without replacement. For those that lived on after the impact, survival became a continuous negotiation with scarcity. Habitats remained damaged long after fires cooled and waters settled. Soils were depleted, plant regrowth was uneven, and familiar food sources could vanish without warning. Many animals likely endured periods of apparent recovery, followed by sudden decline, as brief improvements in conditions were undone by renewed cold, heat, or darkness. Reproduction, the quiet engine of persistence, faltered under such strain. Long-lived species with slow maturation struggled to replace themselves when breeding seasons failed or offspring could not be sustained. Even species that survived 1 year could be pushed closer to extinction the next by a poorly timed climate swing or another collapse in food availability. The aftermath punished consistency, favoring instead those able to survive repeated disappointment. The world demanded endurance, not just through one crisis, but through a sequence of them, each compounding the last. In this way, extinction became a process rather than an event, something that crept forward invisibly, generation by generation. This prolonged unraveling created what scientists often describe as the long tail of the apocalypse, a period when conditions were no longer catastrophic in appearance, yet still hostile enough to prevent recovery. Ecosystems functioned in truncated form, missing key players, simplified in structure, and fragile under pressure. Predators existed without abundant prey, plants without stable seasons, oceans without the rich productivity that once supported complexity. Life persisted, but it did so cautiously, occupying narrow margins where survival was possible but growth was limited. Many species likely hovered near extinction for extended periods, their populations too small and scattered to leave much trace until they disappeared quietly from the record. Others adapted by becoming less specialized, reducing body size, or altering behavior in ways that favored survival over efficiency. These changes did not happen quickly or cleanly. They accumulated through trial and loss, shaped by an environment that allowed no surplus and offered no forgiveness for miscalculation. Understanding extinction as a drawn out process rather than an instant collapse reshapes how this moment in Earth's history is seen. The impact acted as a trigger, but the true filter of survival was time. Species were not judged only on whether they could live through fire or darkness, but on whether they could continue living without a functioning world beneath them. Persistence required bodies that could survive repeated shortages, reproduction that could succeed under stress, and behaviors flexible enough to cope with uncertainty. The apocalypse did not end when skies began to clear. It lingered in depleted soils, empty reefs, and simplified food webs, shaping life long after the dramatic imagery faded. What remained was a planet carrying forward only those lineages capable of enduring a future that arrived slowly, unevenly, and without promise. As the long aftermath continued to thin the living world, the pattern of loss became clearer, not through spectacle, but through absence. Entire branches of life simply stopped continuing, their lineages ending quietly as the years passed without successful reproduction or recovery. On land, many of the great non-avian dinosaurs belong to this group, not because they lacked resilience in earlier ages, but because their survival strategies were built for stable abundance rather than prolonged scarcity. Large herbivores that depended on continuous plant growth faded as landscapes failed to renew themselves, and with them disappeared the predators that relied on their presence. Some reptiles, once dominant and diverse, vanished almost entirely from certain regions, unable to cope with the combined pressures of food shortage, temperature instability, and disrupted breeding cycles. In the oceans, many plankton species that had formed the base of marine food webs ceased to appear in sediments above the boundary layer, their disappearance cascading upward through fish, reptiles, and reef dwellers. Reef builders themselves declined dramatically, taking with them complex communities that depended on their slow construction. These groups did not all die at the same moment, but their trajectories pointed in the same direction, downward and irreversible. Their extinction was complete, not because they lacked strength or evolutionary success in the past, but because the world they were shaped for no longer existed. Alongside these losses, other groups managed to persist, though often only narrowly. Some mammals survived by remaining small, flexible, and quiet, living close to the ground where shelter and alternative food sources were more accessible. Certain reptiles endured by relying on low metabolic needs, allowing them to survive long periods with little intake. In the seas, a fraction of plankton species adapted to dimmer conditions or could rely on chemical pathways less dependent on direct sunlight, allowing fragments of marine productivity to continue. These survivors did not emerge unscathed or abundant. Their populations were reduced, fragmented, and often geographically constrained. Survival, in this context, did not mean thriving. It meant lasting just long enough for conditions to slowly improve. Even within these groups, many lineages vanished while a few persisted, suggesting that survival hinged on subtle differences rather than broad categories alone. Slight variations in diet, reproductive timing, habitat preference, or tolerance for instability made the difference between continuation and disappearance. The boundary between survival and extinction ran not between entire classes of animals, but through them, selecting quietly and unevenly. This unevenness reveals the selective nature of extinction during this period, which operated less like a sweeping judgment and more like a sieve. Traits that had once been neutral or even disadvantageous suddenly became essential. Small body size reduced energy demands. Flexible diets allowed switching between scarce resources. Shorter generation times increased the chance that at least some offspring would be born during brief windows of improved conditions. Shelter, whether underground, underwater, or within remaining vegetation, buffered individuals from temperature extremes and environmental stress. Meanwhile, traits that once conferred dominance, such as large size, specialization, or complex dependency on stable ecosystems, became liabilities. Extinction did not favor the strongest, the fastest, or the most imposing. It favored those that could endure quietly, adjust repeatedly, and accept a diminished world without exhausting themselves. The pattern that emerged was not clean or fair, but deeply informative. It showed that survival during planetary crisis is not a reward for past success, but a test of compatibility with uncertainty. The living world that remained after these years of loss was thinner, simpler, and more cautious, composed of lineages that carried resilience not as a visible trait, but as an underlying flexibility. Earth's biosphere moved forward, not with its former giants and specialists, but with those that could wait, adapt, and persist without certainty, reshaping life's future through absence as much as through survival. As the shattered world lingered in scarcity and instability, one pattern emerged with quiet consistency. Large bodies struggled where smaller ones endured. In earlier ages, size had been an advantage written deeply into the living world. Large animals could travel farther, store more energy, defend themselves more easily, and dominate access to food. Their bodies were shaped for landscapes where productivity was reliable, where plants returned each season, and where prey populations could recover from loss. In the aftermath of collapse, those assumptions no longer held. Food did not return on schedule, seasons lost their predictability, and landscapes that once supported abundance became thin and unreliable. Large animals required constant intake simply to maintain their mass. Muscles had to be fed, internal heat had to be sustained, and complex organs demanded steady energy even during rest. When food supplies dwindled, these requirements did not shrink with them. Instead, they became relentless drains on bodies already pushed to their limits. Even when large animals survived the earliest phases of darkness and cooling, they entered a prolonged mismatch between what their bodies demanded and what the environment could provide. Movement itself became costly. Long migrations in search of food expended energy that could not easily be replaced. Periods of fasting that smaller animals could tolerate became lethal over time. The very scale that once defined success became an anchor, holding these animals in place as the world around them changed faster than they could adjust. This imbalance between energy needs and food availability defined the failure of gigantism under collapse. In ecosystems reduced to fragments, food appeared sporadically and unevenly, favoring creatures that could survive on little, store what they found, or remain inactive for extended periods. Smaller animals required less absolute energy, and their lower metabolic demands allowed them to stretch scarce resources further. They could hide, wait, and adjust activity to conditions in ways that large bodies could not easily manage. Reproduction added another layer to the problem. Large animals tended to reproduce slowly, investing heavily in each offspring and requiring stable conditions across long stretches of time. In a world where conditions shifted repeatedly and unpredictably, those investments often failed. Young did not survive long enough to mature, pregnancies could not be sustained, and population recovery lagged behind loss. Smaller species, with shorter generation times and lower investment per offspring, could rebound more quickly during brief windows of improvement, even if those windows closed again soon after. Gigantism, which thrives on long term stability and surplus, had no such flexibility. It depended on continuity that no longer existed. The collapse exposed a fundamental truth about scale and survival. Evolution favors large size only when the world can reliably support it. When that support vanished, so did the advantage. As years passed and ecosystems continued to contract, the disappearance of large animals reshaped the planet's surface in subtle ways. Landscapes once molded by heavy footsteps and grazing pressure grew quieter, no longer stirred or maintained by massive bodies moving through them. Forest regeneration followed new patterns. Soil changed without constant disturbance, and remaining life adjusted to a world without its former giants. This shift did not signal an immediate improvement or recovery. It marked a simplification, a narrowing of possibilities down to forms that could exist within severe limits. The failure of gigantism was not dramatic or sudden. It unfolded patiently, generation by generation, as large animals found fewer chances to endure a world that could no longer feed them. Survival favored restraint, efficiency, and moderation rather than reach or dominance. Earth moved forward carrying smaller, lighter forms of life, not because they were superior in all ways, but because they fit what the planet had become. As the world settled into prolonged scarcity and instability, movement alone no longer guaranteed survival. In earlier times, speed had offered escape from predators, and flight had opened access to wide territories rich with food. After the collapse, those advantages became complicated. Landscapes were stripped of abundance, and traveling farther often meant spending precious energy without any certainty of reward. Open skies did not lead to fertile ground. Long journeys crossed emptier forests, barren plains, and coastlines that could no longer offer consistent nourishment. Animals built for speed or sustained flight carried bodies tuned to high energy turnover, muscles that demanded frequent fueling, and organs calibrated for constant activity. In a world where food arrived sporadically and unpredictably, these designs became difficult to sustain. Motion itself became expensive, and the very act of searching could push an animal closer to exhaustion. Mobility still mattered, but only when paired with restraint. Those that moved constantly without regard for cost struggled to balance what they spent with what they gained. Survival shifted toward creatures that moved carefully, paused often, and treated energy like a limited currency rather than an abundant resource. High metabolism, once a powerful engine for growth and dominance, revealed its hidden cost in this new reality. Bodies that burned energy quickly produced heat, supported rapid response, and fueled complex behaviors. But they also demanded regular intake to keep functioning. When food chains collapsed and recovery came in brief, uneven pulses, that demand became a liability. Periods without feeding that smaller or slower organisms could tolerate turn dangerous for those with fast-burning systems. Heat maintenance alone consumed valuable calories during cold intervals, while muscle upkeep drained reserves even during rest. For flying animals, the issue extended beyond movement. Flight muscles are among the most energy-intensive tissues in the animal kingdom, requiring constant maintenance whether used or not. In times of scarcity, these muscles could not simply be turned off. The cost continued quietly, day and night, even when flight brought no benefit. Animals with lower metabolic rates could slow their internal pace, stretching limited food across longer spans of time. They could retreat into shelters, reduce activity, and wait. High metabolism offered little flexibility in a world that demanded patience above all else. The aftermath of the impact turned survival into a series of trade-offs where no trait existed in isolation. Speed without efficiency drained bodies too quickly. Efficiency without mobility risked trapping animals in depleted areas. The line between success and failure depended on balance rather than extremes. Creatures that could both move when necessary and remain still when movement offered no reward found an advantage. Those capable of short bursts of activity followed by long periods of conservation fared better than those locked into constant motion. In this environment, subtle physiological differences mattered more than obvious abilities. Digestive flexibility, tolerance for fasting, and the ability to lower energy output without harm became decisive. Even among animals capable of flight, survival favored those that could glide rather than flap constantly, perch for long stretches, and subsist on a range of low-quality foods. Mobility remained useful, but only when it served efficiency rather than opposing it. The post-impact world did not reward the fastest or the most active. It favored those that could afford to wait, choose when to move, and survive long spans, where doing very little was the safest possible strategy. As scarcity deepened and instability became the background of daily life, the difference between exposure and protection grew stark. The world above ground remained unpredictable, marked by lingering cold, sudden warmth, ash-filled skies, and landscapes stripped of reliable cover. In this environment, shelter became more than a place of rest. It became a way of moderating reality itself. Burrows, dense vegetation, rock crevices, and bodies of water offered pockets where extremes softened. Beneath the surface, temperatures shifted more slowly, moisture lingered longer, and light faded into gentle dimness rather than abrupt absence. These spaces did not provide abundance, but they offered consistency. Animals that could retreat underground found respite from temperature swings and protection from ash and debris still circulating through the air. Burrows trapped warmth during cold intervals and remained cooler during sudden heat, creating narrow zones where life could continue with less energy spent on survival. Water provided similar buffering. Streams, lakes, and coastlines changed more slowly than dry land, their thermal mass absorbing shocks that scorched or froze exposed environments. Creatures that lived near or within water could escape fire, find refuge from extremes, and access food sources that persisted longer than those on land. Shelter, in all its forms, acted as insulation not only against climate, but against chaos. Exposed animals, faced a very different reality. Without cover, they endured every fluctuation directly: heat, cold, hunger, and danger, arriving without delay or moderation. Open landscapes offered little protection from falling debris during the early phases and little relief from temperature swings later on. For large animals accustomed to roaming wide territories, exposure was compounded by scale. Their bodies presented more surface area to lose heat, more tissue to maintain, and fewer options to hide effectively. Smaller creatures that remained exposed suffered as well, forced to expend precious energy simply staying alive in environments that shifted faster than their physiology could accommodate. Nesting sites vanished as vegetation burned or died back, leaving eggs and young vulnerable. Even predators struggled, as open ground made hunting more energetically expensive and less reliable. The absence of shelter amplified every stressor, turning survivable challenges into insurmountable ones. In contrast, those that could disappear from sight, even briefly, gained critical advantages. A few hours of stability could mean the difference between life and exhaustion, between recovery and decline. Environmental buffering emerged as one of the quiet determinants of survival, not flashy or dramatic, but deeply effective. Places that softened extremes allowed organisms to reduce energy loss, preserve water, and wait out unfavorable conditions. This buffering operated on multiple scales. Underground habitats moderated temperature minute by minute. Forest understories, though diminished, filtered light and wind. Wetlands retained moisture and supported insects and other small food sources long after surrounding areas failed. Even within damaged ecosystems, microhabitats formed refuges where life could persist. Survival favored those able to locate, create, or exploit these spaces. Flexibility in habitat use mattered as much as flexibility in diet. Creatures that could shift between shelter types, burrow when needed, take cover near water, or shelter beneath remaining vegetation, navigated the broken world more successfully than those tied to a single exposed niche. Over time, these choices shaped which lineages endured. Shelter did not eliminate hunger or instability, but it reduced their intensity, buying time in a world where time itself had become the rarest resource. As years passed and the planet slowly began to recover its rhythms, the legacy of shelter remained written into survival patterns. The living world that continued forward bore the imprint of those buffered spaces, carrying traits shaped by retreat, patience, and protection. Earth did not select for boldness or visibility in this era. It favored those that could step out of the storm, conserve themselves in quiet corners, and endure without drawing attention. In a broken world, survival often meant being unseen, cradled by the planet itself in pockets where chaos softened just enough to allow life to continue. As habitats contracted and familiar food webs unraveled, survival began to hinge on what could be eaten as much as on how food was found. In the world that followed the collapse, abundance no longer defined success. Consistency did. Animals that relied on a narrow range of foods found themselves trapped by their own precision. Specialists had evolved in landscapes where resources returned predictably, where the plants or prey they depended on were abundant enough to sustain highly tuned feeding strategies. When those resources vanished or became rare, specialization offered little room to adapt. Beaks, teeth, and digestive systems shaped for specific foods could not easily be repurposed. For many such species, even the presence of potential food mattered little if their bodies could not process it. In contrast, generalists, creatures accustomed to shifting between food sources, gained a quiet advantage. They were not efficient at any single resource, but they could tolerate many: roots, seeds, Insects, carrion, detritus, and stored reserves all became part of an expanded menu in a world where waiting for ideal conditions was no longer an option. The ability to accept less than perfect nourishment allowed these organisms to persist through periods that would have starved more selective feeders. Eating anything available did not mean thriving. Much of what remained after the collapse was low in energy and difficult to digest. Seeds required strong jaws or specialized processing but offered concentrated nutrition that could persist long after leaves died back. Insects remained abundant in pockets, feeding on decaying matter and acting as bridges between plant loss and animal survival. Carrion, though transient and risky, provided rare bursts of calories for those willing to exploit it. Even fungi and microbial films became indirect food sources, supporting small creatures that fed on them or on others that did. Opportunistic diets allowed energy to flow through truncated ecosystems in new, simpler ways. Animals capable of switching between these options could survive on marginal gains, collecting small amounts of energy from many sources rather than depending on one stable supply. Digestive flexibility mattered as much as taste. Bodies able to handle variable textures, toxins, and nutrient profiles endured better than those built for consistency. In a world where the old rules of abundance had collapsed, persistence required tolerance rather than preference. This shift elevated simplicity over refinement. Complex feeding strategies, finely balanced over evolutionary time, struggled when their supporting networks disappeared. In contrast, simple diets reduced dependency on any single link in the food web. Generalists required fewer moving parts in their survival strategy, fewer assumptions about what the environment would provide next. This simplicity extended beyond food choice into behavior. Opportunistic feeders adjusted activity patterns, feeding at unusual times or in unusual places, accepting risk and inefficiency as the cost of survival. The advantage lay not in maximizing intake, but in avoiding starvation altogether. Over years of instability, these small decisions accumulated into survival patterns visible in the fossil record as uneven persistence. Species that endured did so not by finding perfect food, but by finding enough. Earth's broken ecosystems rewarded those that could extract value from leftovers, from decay, from what others could not or would not use. Diet flexibility did not create dominance or rapid recovery. It allowed life to continue quietly, threading energy through a world that had lost much of its former productivity. As conditions slowly improved, these flexible feeders formed the foundation upon which more complex food webs could eventually rebuild, carrying forward a lesson written in scarcity that adaptability in nourishment can be as decisive as any physical trait. As the damaged world stretched from years into decades, another quiet filter shaped which forms of life would remain, the pace at which a species could replace itself. Survival was no longer decided only by enduring hunger, cold, or instability as individuals. It depended on whether a lineage could pass through those conditions without running out of time. Species with long generation spans carried an invisible vulnerability. Their lives unfolded slowly, with extended periods before maturity and heavy investment in a small number of offspring. In a stable world, this strategy allowed careful development, learning, and survival skills to be passed forward with reliability. In a disrupted world, it became fragile. Each lost breeding season mattered. Each failed offspring represented a much larger fraction of a population's future. When environmental swings erased food at the wrong moment, interrupted migration, or destabilized nesting grounds, these species could not easily recover. Their populations thinned not through dramatic die-offs, but through silence, fewer births than deaths, fewer young reaching maturity, until continuation quietly failed. Time itself became a pressure, pushing against life histories built for patience rather than speed. In contrast, species with short generation times held a subtle but powerful advantage. They reproduced quickly, reached maturity sooner, and required fewer years of stability for their populations to persist. Fast reproduction did not guarantee survival, but it created more chances for it. Brief windows of improved conditions, a slightly warmer season, a short return of food, or a temporary calm in temperature swings could be enough for these organisms to produce offspring and carry their lineage forward. Even if many young did not survive, the sheer frequency of reproduction increased the odds that some would. This mattered deeply in a world where favorable conditions appeared unpredictably and rarely lasted long. Rapid reproduction allowed populations to respond almost immediately to opportunity rather than waiting years for readiness. It also accelerated adaptation, variations that improved tolerance to darkness, cold, or scarce food could spread more quickly through populations that turned over rapidly. The catastrophe favored not those that lived longest as individuals, but those that renewed themselves fastest as lineages. The form reproduction took also mattered. Eggs, rather than live birth, offered certain advantages in unstable environments. Eggs could be laid in sheltered locations, buried, hidden, or protected by simple behaviors that required less sustained energy investment. They separated the survival of offspring from the constant metabolic demands of a parent's body. If conditions worsened suddenly, a parent that had already laid eggs had at least transferred its chance forward. Eggs also allowed flexibility in timing. Some could wait through unfavorable periods, delayed in development until conditions improved slightly. While many eggs failed, the cost of producing them was lower than sustaining a developing young internally over long spans of scarcity. Species that laid multiple eggs spread risk rather than concentrating it. Even among those that cared for offspring, shorter developmental times reduced exposure to prolonged stress. Young that grew quickly could reach independence during brief reprieves, whereas slow-growing offspring faced a higher likelihood of being caught by the next downturn. Under catastrophe, reproduction became an exercise in probability rather than precision. The environment no longer rewarded careful planning for a predictable future. It rewarded strategies that increased the number of attempts, even if each attempt carried lower individual odds. This shift reshaped survival at the deepest level. Lineages that could produce many offspring, quickly and with modest investment, persisted through repeated setbacks. Those that required stability across long developmental timelines struggled to maintain continuity. Over generations, this difference accumulated, thinning some branches of life while allowing others to quietly expand into the emptied spaces left behind. Reproduction under catastrophe favored resilience through repetition, the steady offering of life into uncertainty, rather than the careful nurturing of a few. The living world that moved forward carried this imprint, shaped not only by who could endure the moment, but by who could keep beginning again despite it. As the long aftermath narrowed the living world to its most enduring forms, it became clear that survival had not been invented in the moment of catastrophe. The traits that carried certain lineages through darkness, hunger, and instability had been shaping quietly for millions of years before the sky ever burned. Evolution does not anticipate disasters, but it experiments constantly, producing variation that seems unnecessary or inefficient under stable conditions. In ordinary times, many of these traits appear marginal, even burdensome. Small body size limits dominance. Slow movement reduces competitive reach. Flexible diets sacrifice efficiency for tolerance. Burrowing, hiding, and waiting can seem like signs of weakness in a world that rewards expansion. Yet when the environment broke, these overlooked characteristics revealed their value. The survivors were not those that changed fastest after impact. They were those whose bodies, behaviors, and life histories already aligned with scarcity, unpredictability, and restraint. What looked like compromise before became compatibility after. This distinction matters because it reshapes how survival is understood. There was no sudden wave of adaptation that swept through life in response to the asteroid. No species reinvented itself in the months following impact. Genetic change unfolds across generations, and the world did not offer the stability or time required for last-minute transformations. Instead, selection acted like a quiet sorting process, filtering pre-existing variation through extreme conditions. Individuals already capable of enduring long periods without food, tolerating wide temperature ranges, reproducing quickly, or surviving in shelter-rich environments persisted. Those without such traits disappeared, regardless of how successful they had been before. This explains why survival appears uneven and sometimes counterintuitive in the fossil record. Closely related species diverged in fate, not because one adapted heroically while the other failed, but because subtle differences already present became decisive. A slightly broader diet, a modest reduction in size, a preference for ground-level habitats, or a shorter generation time could determine continuation or extinction. The asteroid did not reward innovation in the moment. It rewarded preparation written quietly into bodies long before. Pre-existing resilience often arose from living in marginal environments even before the catastrophe. Species accustomed to seasonal scarcity, variable climates, or fragmented habitats carried built-in flexibility. They had already learned how to persist when conditions were unreliable. Their physiological systems were more tolerant of fluctuation, their behaviors less dependent on narrow timing, and their survival strategies less rigidly optimized for abundance. Life near the edges of ecosystems, in understories, wetlands, shorelines, and underground spaces, produced organisms that valued caution over expansion. These forms of life rarely dominate stable ecosystems, but they endure disturbance better than specialists tied to peak conditions. When the global environment began behaving like a perpetual disturbance, this resilience scaled up from local advantage to planetary importance. The world after impact resembled a harsher version of places these organisms already knew how to navigate. This perspective also softens the idea of survival as victory. The lineages that endured did not win through superiority in strength, intelligence, or dominance. They simply matched what the planet became. Their survival was less an achievement than a continuity, a matter of already fitting into a narrower set of possibilities. In that sense, the catastrophe revealed something fundamental about evolution. Adaptation is not only about moving forward, it is also about remaining viable when forward motion stops. Traits that seem inefficient or limiting under stable conditions can become lifelines when systems collapse. Earth did not create new survivors in the aftermath. It revealed which forms of life had always been quietly prepared for uncertainty. As time passed and conditions slowly eased, these survivors formed the starting point for future diversity. The world that rebuilt itself did so on foundations shaped by restraint, flexibility, and endurance. Later, abundance would allow new experiments in size, speed, and complexity, but the continuity of life depended first on those lineages that had never relied on abundance in the first place. Their story is not one of sudden transformation, but of long patience. Survival, in this moment of Earth's history, belonged to those who had already learned how to live with less, long before everything was taken away. By the time the world had narrowed survival down to restraint and flexibility, the word dinosaur no longer meant what it once had. For much of the Mesozoic, dinosaurs were imagined through their largest forms, towering bodies shaped by abundance, stability, and long dominance. Yet beneath that familiar image existed a quieter diversity, lineages that never grew massive, never ruled open landscapes, and never relied on size to succeed. These small dinosaurs lived close to the ground, threaded through undergrowth, forest edges, and cluttered environments where agility and caution mattered more than strength. They were rarely the most visible animals in their ecosystems, and their fossil record is often fragmented, not because they were rare, but because their light bodies and delicate bones were less likely to survive deep time. Still, evidence shows that these small forms were numerous, varied, and already well established long before the catastrophe arrived. They fed on insects, seeds, small vertebrates, and whatever else could be gathered within short distances, living lives shaped by patchiness rather than abundance. Their world was one of hiding, darting, waiting, and adjusting, a rhythm that would soon prove compatible with the planet's new reality. Some dinosaur lineages had been shrinking even before the asteroid fell, a trend driven not by decline, but by opportunity. As forests spread and environments became more complex, smaller body sizes allowed access to ecological niches closed to larger animals. Dense vegetation favored creatures that could move through it without drawing attention. Forest floors offered insects, fallen seeds, and shelter, rewards best exploited by light bodies with quick reflexes. Over generations, certain dinosaur groups adapted to these spaces, evolving proportions that favored balance, maneuverability, and lower energy demands. Shrinking did not mean weakness. It meant specialization for environments where subtlety mattered. These dinosaurs were not competing with giants on open plains. They were living beneath them, alongside them, in a parallel world defined by cover and complexity. By the time global collapse arrived, these traits were not experimental. They were refined, tested, and deeply integrated into daily survival. Ecological niches near the ground became some of the last places where life could persist through prolonged hardship. After the collapse, forests thinned and open canopies failed, but ground level environments retained pockets of shelter and food longer than exposed landscapes. Seeds persisted in soil, insects fed on decaying matter. Burrows, roots, fallen logs, and remaining vegetation created microhabitats buffered from temperature swings and ash-filled air. Small dinosaurs already accustomed to navigating these spaces could continue doing so when larger animals could not. Their low energy requirements reduced dependence on steady food supplies, while their proximity to shelter allowed rapid retreat from danger or extreme conditions. Movement near the ground demanded less energy than sustained travel across open terrain or flight through unstable skies. These dinosaurs did not need vast territories to survive. They needed familiarity with small spaces and the patience to endure within them. What makes these lineages especially important is not just that they survived, but that their survival was unremarkable in the moment. They did not suddenly transform or take over immediately after the catastrophe. They persisted quietly, maintaining continuity while the world slowly recalibrated. Their success was not built on dominance, but on fit. Bodies already optimized for flexibility, small-scale movement, and opportunistic feeding found themselves matched to the new conditions without needing reinvention. As ecosystems slowly began to recover, these survivors formed a living bridge between deep time and the future, carrying dinosaur traits forward into a transformed world. The story of the small dinosaurs is not one of last minute luck. It is a reminder that survival often hides in the margins, shaped long before it is needed. Long before Earth went silent, these creatures were already living in ways that would allow them to continue when nearly everything else could not. As forests thinned and canopies failed, the shape of survival flattened toward the ground. The upper world of branches, leaves, and filtered light had once supported vast networks of life, but as trees died back and growth stalled, those elevated spaces became unstable and unreliable. Falling limbs, collapsing trunks, and the absence of new growth transformed forests from layered ecosystems into broken skeletons. What remained was closer to the soil, where change arrived more slowly and resources lingered longer. Life near the ground gained quiet advantages not through abundance, but through persistence. Seeds accumulated in the earth, stored from seasons past, wading through darkness and cold. Insects gathered in leaf litter and decaying wood, feeding on what remained rather than what was newly grown. Moisture held longer beneath fallen debris, and temperature shifted less violently just above and below the surface. Ground level environments offered continuity when everything above them unraveled. Creatures that lived low did not depend on foliage returning quickly or on stable canopy cover. They navigated a world already accustomed to clutter, shadow, and unevenness. Movement close to the earth required less energy, fewer assumptions, and offered more immediate access to shelter. These advantages were subtle, but they compounded over time, turning proximity to the ground into one of the most reliable survival traits of the aftermath. Access mattered as much as availability. Seeds that fell before the collapse did not vanish when sunlight faded. They remained locked in soil, bark, and hardened shells, dense packets of energy that could outlast long periods of scarcity. Insects, resilient and adaptable, continued to reproduce in hidden places, feeding on decay rather than growth, forming a living bridge between dead ecosystems and surviving food webs. Small vertebrates and other ground-level animals could exploit these resources without exposing themselves to open air or long travel. Shelter came in many forms: shallow burrows, root systems, rock gaps, fallen logs, even the layered remains of dead forests themselves. These spaces buffered wind, ash, and temperature swings, allowing animals to conserve energy and reduce risk. Ground level life also benefited from proximity between food and cover. A creature could feed briefly, then retreat, repeating this cycle without venturing far. In contrast, animals dependent on height or open terrain faced empty expanses between meals, each journey carrying cost and danger. Near the earth, survival became local, repetitive, and cautious, a rhythm well suited to a world where consistency had vanished. The death of forests changed everything, not just ecologically, but structurally. Trees had once linked soil to sky, cycling energy upward and outward, supporting complex interactions across layers of life. When they died, that vertical system collapsed into horizontal fragments. Energy no longer moved upward efficiently. It pooled near the ground instead, trapped in seeds, insects, fungi, and decaying matter. This redistribution favored organisms already adapted to ground-based existence. It also reshaped predator and prey relationships, reducing visibility and long-range movement, emphasizing ambush, hiding, and short bursts of activity. Forest loss removed the advantage of height and reach. replacing it with a landscape where closeness, patience, and low profiles mattered most. The world became quieter and closer, its living activity pressed against the surface like a low tide that never fully returned. Life that endured did so not by rising above the destruction, but by staying beneath it, woven into the soil and shadows that held the last stable pieces of a broken planet. As green growth faded from the surface and the familiar pathways of nourishment broke apart, life did not lose food entirely. It lost immediacy. What remained were forms of energy that moved slowly, quietly, and often invisibly beneath the chaos. Seeds became one of the most important of these enduring stores. Formed before the collapse, sealed against time and hardship, they carried concentrated nutrition protected by hard coats and chemical defenses. Unlike leaves, which depend on constant light and water to remain viable, seeds are built to wait. They tolerate darkness, cold, and burial, holding their value long after the plants that produce them have withered away. Scattered across soil, trapped in bark, buried by wind and debris, seeds persisted through seasons where no new growth appeared. For animals capable of finding and processing them, they offered rare reliability. Eating a seed meant consuming energy captured months or years earlier, energy preserved from a world that no longer existed. This meant that nourishment did not vanish all at once. It shifted into storage. Life learned to feed not on what was growing, but on what had already been made and hidden away. Leaves, by contrast, were fleeting. Once sunlight failed, they ceased production almost immediately. They dried, fell, and decayed, offering little sustained nutrition beyond their brief transition into detritus. Their value lay primarily in feeding the organisms that break things down rather than those that graze or browse. Seeds outlasted leaves because they were designed for survival between moments of opportunity. Their purpose had always been patience. Under catastrophe, that patience became a planetary lifeline. Animals that could crack, grind, digest, or cache seeds gained access to a food source that did not require living plants to exist. Even small quantities could sustain life through lean periods when nothing else remained. This shifted feeding strategies toward collection rather than grazing, toward careful use rather than abundance. The land no longer fed life daily. It fed it occasionally in fragments saved from the past. Insects formed the bridge that allowed this stored energy to keep moving. As plants died and leaf production collapsed, insects did not disappear. Many turned to decay, fungi, and the remains of plants and animals, extracting energy from materials that larger organisms could not process directly. Some fed on seeds themselves, others on wood, leaf litter, or microbial films growing in damp, sheltered places. Insects reproduced quickly and occupied countless microhabitats, from soil layers to fallen logs to shallow water edges. Their small size allowed them to survive on minimal resources, and their rapid life cycles ensured that even unstable conditions could support continuous turnover. In doing so, insects converted, preserved, or decomposing energy into living tissue, becoming nourishment for animals higher up the food chain. This made them essential, not as a dominant force, but as a connective one. Without insects, energy stored in seeds and decay would have remained locked away. With them, it flowed onward, quietly sustaining birds, reptiles, mammals, and other survivors that depended on animal protein rather than raw plant matter. This quiet food chain did not resemble the rich, layered ecosystems of the past. It was simpler, thinner, and slower. Energy moved in short steps rather than broad cascades. Meals were smaller and less predictable. Yet this simplicity made the system resilient. It required no sunlight in the moment, no fresh growth, and no large populations to function. It relied on what had already been captured, preserved, or broken down. Seeds provided the initial store. Insects unlocked and redistributed that store. Small predators and opportunists followed, sustaining themselves on the movement rather than the abundance of energy. This was not a food web built for expansion, it was one built for endurance. As years passed under unstable skies, this quiet chain carried life through the narrowest bottleneck. It asked little of the world and offered little in return beyond continuity. When light and growth eventually began to return, it was this understated network that formed the base upon which more complex systems could slowly rebuild. The future of life did not begin with flourishing forests or vast herds. It began with what could be eaten when almost nothing was growing, with seeds that waited and insects that bridged the gap between what had been and what could come again. As the world thinned and survival pressed closer to the ground, flight did not function as a simple means of escape. The skies, still unstable and often hostile, offered no safe passage away from the planet's problems. Darkness, ash, and shifting air carried danger rather than refuge, and long-distance flight demanded energy that was rarely available. For many creatures, taking to the air would have meant trading one uncertainty for another, expending precious reserves without any assurance of improvement at the destination. In this context, flight was not a heroic dash from destruction. It was a quieter tool, used selectively and sparingly. Its value lay not in speed or dramatic departure, but in efficiency and choice. Flight allowed movement when movement mattered, and restraint when it did not. It offered a way to navigate a broken world without remaining trapped within any single depleted patch of ground. The true advantage of flight under these conditions came from its ability to reduce the cost of relocation. Flying over damaged terrain required less time and often less energy than crossing it on foot, particularly for small animals adapted to short, controlled flights rather than constant flapping. Even brief aerial movement could link isolated pockets of survivable habitat, allowing access to scattered food sources that were otherwise unreachable without long, risky journeys. This was especially important in landscapes fractured by fire, flooding, or vegetation loss, where continuous habitats had broken into islands of opportunity separated by stretches of scarcity. Flight allowed these islands to remain functionally connected. A short glide from one fallen tree to another, a careful movement between sheltered valleys, or a repositioning along water edges could make the difference between starvation and persistence. The energy savings came not from flying long distances non-stop, but from avoiding prolonged ground travel, reducing exposure to predators and extremes, and shortening the time spent searching. In a world where every calorie counted, these small efficiencies accumulated into survival advantages. Flight also enabled a form of independence from constant ground dependence. Ground-based life, while rich in shelter and stored resources, could become limiting when conditions changed suddenly. Flooding, localized fires, or the depletion of a specific area could force rapid relocation. For animals capable of flight, relocation did not require waiting for corridors to open or vegetation to recover. It could happen opportunistically, guided by immediate assessment rather than long planning. This flexibility allowed flying creatures to track favorable microclimates, follow insect blooms, or reach water sources as they shifted across a damaged landscape. Crucially, this did not require constant movement. Flight allowed a return to stillness once relocation was achieved. Animals could perch, rest, and conserve energy between movements, treating flight as an occasional tool rather than a perpetual state. This balance of mobility and rest aligned well with a world defined by unpredictability. Reconsidered in this light, flight was not an escape from Earth, but a way to remain connected to it under altered conditions. It allowed life to operate across scales, moving between ground and air as needed, drawing resources from both without relying exclusively on either. Flight reduced dependence on continuous ground pathways and local abundance, enabling survival in fragmented environments where food and shelter existed in scattered pockets. Over time, this adaptability supported persistence and gradual expansion once stability began to return. The world that emerged after the collapse did not favor constant motion or dramatic migration. It favored selective movement, careful use of energy, and the ability to reposition without exhausting reserves. Flight, stripped of its spectacle, became one of many quiet strategies that allowed life to bridge the gaps left behind by catastrophe, maintaining continuity in a planet that had lost much of its former coherence. As temperature swings continued to unsettle the planet, another quiet divide shaped survival: the ability to regulate heat from within. In the unstable climate that followed the collapse, cold often arrived suddenly and without warning, lingering long enough to drain energy from bodies exposed to it. For animals whose body temperature followed the environment closely, this meant slowing down whenever warmth faded. Movement became difficult, digestion slowed, and reaction times dulled precisely when flexibility and responsiveness were most needed. Endothermy, the ability to generate and regulate internal heat, offered a different path. Warm-blooded creatures carried their own stability inside them, maintaining a narrow range of temperature even as the world outside lurched between extremes. This internal steadiness allowed muscles to function, senses to remain sharp, and digestion to continue during cold periods that immobilized other forms of life. In a landscape where nights stretched long and seasons blurred, being able to stay warm meant being able to remain active, even quietly, when others were forced into stillness. Warm blood did not shield animals from scarcity or danger, but it allowed them to operate within it rather than waiting helplessly for conditions to improve. Regulating body heat mattered not because warmth itself was comfort, but because it preserved function. An animal that could forage briefly during cold intervals gained access to food sources unavailable to cold-slowed competitors. Insects hiding beneath debris, seeds cached in soil, or small prey still active in buffered spaces could be reached when ectothermic animals remained inactive. Endothermy also protected critical processes like reproduction and growth. Eggs could be incubated more reliably, and developing young experienced fewer disruptions from temperature fluctuations. The ability to maintain warmth through the night, during ash-dimmed days, or under lingering cold reduced the number of pauses imposed by the environment. In a world defined by interruption, continuity became an advantage. Warm blood allowed life to keep moving forward in small increments, stitching together moments of opportunity that cold-blooded organisms might miss entirely. This did not create dominance or abundance, but it created access, the ability to use brief windows of possibility scattered throughout an otherwise hostile landscape. The cost of this strategy was significant. Producing internal heat required constant energy, and in a world where food was scarce, that demand could be dangerous. Warm-blooded animals had to eat more frequently, balancing the benefits of activity against the risk of starvation. Heat loss through small bodies or exposed surfaces increased metabolic demands even further, making insulation, shelter, and behavioral restraint essential companions to endothermy. Those that survived did not rely on warmth alone. They combined it with efficiency, reducing unnecessary movement, conserving heat through feathers or fur, and seeking shelter during the coldest periods. The benefit of staying warm was never free. It demanded careful budgeting of energy and strict limits on waste. When balanced successfully, however, endothermy became a powerful tool for persistence. It allowed animals to endure not just cold, but unpredictability itself. While temperature whiplash challenged all life, warm blooded organisms carried an internal anchor that softened those swings. They could operate within a narrower internal world even when the external one became erratic. Over time, this balance shaped which lineages continued. Warm blood did not guarantee survival any more than cold blood guaranteed extinction. Many ectothermic animals endured through shelter and low energy needs. Yet, in a landscape repeatedly chilled and destabilized, the ability to regulate heat expanded the range of conditions under which life could function. It allowed activity in marginal moments, reproduction in uncertain seasons, and movement through cold periods without full shutdown. The world that followed the catastrophe favored those who could maintain internal order amid external chaos. Endothermy was one of several traits that made that possible, not as a triumph of strength, but as a quiet adaptation to a planet that no longer kept its temperature promises. As the planet struggled through instability and slow recovery, the way life began mattered as much as how it endured. In an environment shaped by unpredictability, eggs offered a quiet advantage that live birth could not always match. Carrying developing young inside the body required constant energy, steady access to food, and relative environmental stability over long spans of time. Under collapse, those conditions were rare. Hunger arrived without warning, temperature shifted suddenly, and stress accumulated over months rather than moments. Eggs separated reproduction from prolonged internal investment. Once laid, they allowed the parent to release some of the metabolic burden, preserving energy for survival rather than sustaining development through scarcity. This separation reduced risk in a world where any extended commitment could be disrupted. If conditions worsened unexpectedly, a parent that had already laid eggs had at least passed its lineage forward rather than losing everything at once. Eggs transformed reproduction into a series of smaller risks instead of a single, prolonged gamble. Eggs also offered flexibility in placement and timing, two qualities that became critical after the collapse. Nests did not need to be elaborate or permanent. They could be placed in sheltered ground, under debris, within crevices, or near water, wherever buffering was strongest at that moment. Many eggs required minimal direct care, allowing parents to adjust behavior as conditions changed. If one nesting site failed due to cold, flooding, or disturbance, future eggs could be laid elsewhere without abandoning the reproductive strategy entirely. This adaptability mattered deeply in environments where no location remained reliable for long. Eggs could also be produced in clusters, spreading reproductive effort across space and time. Losses were expected, but not catastrophic when risk was distributed. Even simple nesting strategies allowed life to persist through repeated setbacks, aligning reproduction with uncertainty rather than resisting it. Eggs fit the rhythm of a broken world where safety was temporary and survival depended on repeated attempts rather than guaranteed success. Recovery after population crashes was also faster for egg-laying species. When numbers fell sharply, the ability to produce many offspring quickly became decisive. Eggs allowed populations to rebound during brief windows of improvement, even if those windows closed again soon after. Short development times meant new individuals could reach independence before the environment shifted once more. In contrast, live birth required extended periods of internal development and parental investment, delaying recovery and increasing exposure to ongoing stress. Egg-based reproduction accelerated turnover, increasing the chances that some offspring would encounter favorable conditions. It also allowed variation to spread more quickly, helping populations adjust gradually as the environment changed. Recovery did not depend on long-term planning. It depended on responsiveness. Eggs made responsiveness possible at scale, even in ecosystems stripped of stability and abundance. This did not mean eggs guaranteed survival or that live birth always failed. It meant that under catastrophe, eggs aligned more naturally with the demands of uncertainty. They reduced dependency on constant nourishment, allowed reproduction to pause and resume as conditions allowed, and converted reproduction into a flexible process rather than a fixed commitment. Over generations, these advantages accumulated quietly. Lineages that laid eggs could persist through repeated population declines without exhausting their capacity to begin again. They did not need a long stretch of calm to recover. They needed only brief openings where survival was possible. As Earth slowly moved forward, egg-laying species formed a resilient foundation for future ecosystems. Their reproductive strategy matched a planet relearning how to sustain life unevenly and cautiously. The success of eggs in this era was not dramatic or visible. It was patient and persistent, aligned with a world where certainty had vanished. Life continued not because conditions improved quickly, but because reproduction learned to work with instability rather than against it. Eggs carried that lesson forward, sealed in simple forms, waiting for the next moment when the planet allowed beginnings once more. When the most immediate dangers finally eased, when skies slowly cleared and temperatures began to settle into gentler ranges, Earth did not spring back to life. It entered a long silence, a span of time defined not by catastrophe but by absence. Ecosystems do not rebuild on human timescales, and the damage left behind was not something that seasons could erase. Forests did not return quickly. Reefs did not reassemble themselves. Food webs did not snap back into place. The planet moved forward at a geological pace, inching rather than leaping toward recovery. For millions of years, life remained sparse, simplified, and cautious. The fossil record from this period tells a quiet story. It shows fewer species, smaller bodies, and ecosystems that appear thin, almost hesitant, as if testing each step before committing to it. What once had been dense and layered became open and minimal, with large gaps where entire lineages had once existed. Earth was alive, but it was not yet rich with life. It was learning again how to support complexity. In the early post-impact world, landscapes often looked intact from a distance, but were hollow upon closer inspection. Plains stretched wide, but hosted few large animals. Forests, where they existed, were young and uneven, lacking the towering canopies and deep understories of earlier eras. Oceans cleared of debris, yet remained biologically quiet, dominated by a limited range of organisms adapted to low productivity. The emptiness was not uniform, but it was widespread. Predators were rare, prey was scattered. Competition was minimal, not because resources were abundant, but because there were so few participants left to compete. Many ecological roles remained unfilled for vast stretches of time. Nature did not rush to occupy them. Instead, it waited for conditions to stabilize enough to support expansion. This waiting defined the era. Life persisted without abundance, surviving on modest energy flows and simple interactions rather than dense networks of dependency. Survival during this long silence required a different relationship with the planet. Growth was slow. Reproduction occurred at sustainable, cautious rates. Populations expanded only when resources allowed, and contracted again when conditions shifted. There were no sudden explosions of diversity. Each new branch of life took time to establish itself, tested repeatedly by environmental fluctuations that had not yet fully resolved. The atmosphere, oceans, and climate system continued to adjust long after the impact, settling into new patterns that life had to accommodate gradually. This meant that stability, once rare during the immediate aftermath, remained partial even as recovery began. Organisms that endured this period did not rely on surplus. They lived within limits, using what the environment offered without exhausting it. Their success was measured not by expansion, but by continuity. The length of this silence reshaped evolution itself. Without strong competition, certain traits persisted not because they were optimal, but because they were sufficient. With few predators and limited niches, there was little pressure to grow large or specialize rapidly. Simplicity dominated. Small size, flexible behavior, and modest energy demands continued to define success. When ecosystems finally began to diversify again, they did so on foundations shaped by patience rather than ambition. The planet did not restore what it had lost. It built something new from what had endured. Recovery took millions of years, not because life was incapable, but because rebuilding complexity requires stable feedback between organisms and environment. That feedback had been severed, and reconnecting it took deep time. The long silence after impact stands as one of the most revealing chapters in Earth's history. It shows that survival is not always loud or dramatic. It can be quiet, stretched thin across ages, sustained by organisms that persist without flourishing. Life did not rush to reclaim dominance. It lingered, adjusted, and waited. In that waiting, the outlines of the future began to form, shaped by restraint, endurance, and a careful rebuilding of trust between life and the planet it inhabits. As the long silence gradually softened and the planet's systems edged toward reliability, the living world entered a subtle but decisive shift. The Earth was no longer dominated by collapse, yet it was far from full. Vast spaces remained open, not as wastelands, but as opportunities created by absence. Forests were young and uneven, coastlines quiet, inland regions sparsely occupied. Many ecological roles that had once been tightly held were now empty, waiting without competition. For the lineages that had endured scarcity and instability, this presented a new kind of challenge. Survival alone was no longer enough. Movement into these open spaces required cautious exploration, gradual spread, and careful testing of environments that had not supported complex life for a long time. The survivors did not surge outward in a sudden wave. They expanded slowly, following the return of vegetation, insects, and stable seasonal patterns. Each step forward depended on feedback, food availability, shelter, and climate consistency. Yet compared to the silence that came before, the direction had changed. The world was no longer contracting. It was beginning quietly to open. Expansion into empty ecological niches transformed the pace and shape of evolution. With fewer competitors and predators, organisms encountered conditions that allowed experimentation. Diets could broaden without immediate penalty. Behaviors could shift without being quickly outcompeted. Small populations established themselves in places that would once have been unreachable or too dangerous. River systems, recovering wetlands, forest edges, and newly forming grasslands became pathways rather than barriers. In the oceans, recovering plankton blooms supported new food chains, allowing marine life to extend outward from refuges into broader waters. The absence of dominant forms reduced pressure to specialize immediately. Instead, flexibility continued to be rewarded. The survivors that spread most effectively were those capable of adjusting to local conditions, tolerating variation, and persisting even when productivity fluctuated. This spreading was not reckless. It was measured, shaped by the memory of loss carried in bodies and behaviors refined under collapse. Life moved forward, but it did so with restraint. As stability returned more fully, diversification followed. With ecosystems no longer locked in survival mode, small differences between populations began to matter. Groups separated by geography, climate, or habitat slowly diverged, adapting to their local conditions over long spans of time. This diversification was rapid only in geological terms, unfolding across hundreds of thousands to millions of years rather than instantly. Yet compared to the stagnation of the early post-impact world, it represented renewal. Feathers took on new forms and functions. Body sizes adjusted upward or remained small depending on resource availability. Behaviors became more complex as energy flows increased and food webs rebuilt. Opportunity, rather than dominance, guided these changes. The absence of former giants and specialists left room for expansion that had not existed before. Evolution explored pathways that had once been closed, not because the survivors were superior, but because the landscape of possibility had been cleared. Opportunity created by absence is a recurring theme in Earth's history, but rarely has it been so stark. The survivors did not inherit a full world. They inherited a quiet one. Their success lay not in replacing what was lost, but in responding to what was missing. New ecosystems formed without reference to the old hierarchies, guided instead by the traits that had endured collapse, efficiency, flexibility, small beginnings, and patience. Over time, these systems grew richer and more complex, but their foundations remained shaped by survival through scarcity. The spread of life after the catastrophe was not a return to the past. It was the beginning of a different future, one built from the resilience of those that waited, endured, and then slowly stepped outward into a planet, ready, at last, to hold more than survival alone. Long before the sky became a pathway, feathers were already shaping survival on the ground. Their earliest purpose had nothing to do with lift or distance. Feathers emerged in a world where temperature swings were sharp, predators were close, and bodies needed protection more than reach. Soft, filament-like structures trapped air close to the skin, creating insulation that reduced heat loss during cold nights and dim days. This mattered deeply in an environment where maintaining internal warmth consumed precious energy. Feathers functioned as a quiet barrier between body and world, smoothing temperature changes and conserving heat when the environment offered none in return. Beyond warmth, feathers added a layer of physical protection. They softened impacts during falls or sudden movements through dense undergrowth, shielded skin from debris, and offered limited defense against bites or scratches. In forests cluttered with branches, ash, and falling material, this buffering reduced injury and energy loss. Feathers also played a role in communication and display, carrying patterns and colors that signaled maturity, health, or species identity even in low-light conditions. Display did not disappear during collapse. It changed. Visual signals allowed recognition without prolonged contact, reducing conflict and conserving energy. In this early context, feathers were multifunctional tools shaped by necessity rather than ambition, serving warmth, safety, and social order in a world that demanded efficiency. These traits were already well established when conditions began to stabilize and life cautiously expanded again. As survivors spread into new spaces, the properties of feathers interacted with changing demands in unexpected ways. Insulation that once preserved warmth near the ground also improved control over body temperature during movement. Lightweight structures that protected skin reduced the cost of motion. Feathers along limbs and tails increased surface area, subtly altering how air moved around the body during jumps, descents, or rapid changes in direction. None of this required intentional design. It was a gradual accumulation of side effects layered upon existing function. Creatures that already carried feathers could exploit these effects immediately, even if only marginally. A controlled fall from a low branch, a slower descent over uneven terrain, or improved balance during rapid ground movement offered small advantages that added up over time. In cluttered environments where precision mattered more than speed, these benefits supported survival without demanding radical change. Feathers did not appear because flight was needed. Flight became possible because feathers already existed and could be repurposed. Over generations, as ecosystems grew richer and opportunities widened, these earlier traits gained new roles. Structures that once only trapped warmth began contributing to lift when paired with increased limb movement. Displays became more elaborate, tied not just to mating, but to territorial signals in expanding habitats. Protective qualities allowed bolder exploration of vertical space, as falls became less dangerous and recovery quicker. None of these shifts erased the original purposes of feathers. Instead, they layered new meaning on top of old function. This layering is a hallmark of evolution, where features are reused rather than replaced. Feathers remained insulation, remained protection, remained communication. They simply became more. When true flight eventually emerged, it did so not as a sudden leap, but as a continuation of this pattern. The sky did not call life upward. Life slowly found that it could use the sky because it already possessed the tools to interact with air in controlled, efficient ways. This history reframes flight not as a defining goal, but as an outcome of resilience and reuse. Feathers illustrate how survival traits forged under pressure can later unlock entirely new possibilities when conditions allow. Their story begins in a grounded world, shaped by scarcity and danger, where warmth, protection, and subtle signaling mattered most. Only later, when absence gave way to opportunity and stability returned, did these same traits support movement beyond the surface. Feathers remind us that evolution rarely builds from scratch. It reshapes what already works, carrying forward old solutions into new contexts. In this way, the legacy of survival under catastrophe extended far beyond endurance alone. It quietly prepared life for futures that could not have been imagined when feathers first appeared, serving needs that went far beyond their original purpose. For a long stretch of time after the collapse, the planet moved forward without its largest inhabitants. The towering bodies that had once shaped landscapes through sheer presence were gone, and nothing rose immediately to replace them. This absence was not accidental or brief. For millions of years, large land animals did not exist in any meaningful sense, not because evolution had forgotten how to build them, but because the conditions that allowed giants to persist had not yet returned. Large bodies require more than food in abundance. They require stability, predictable seasons, and ecosystems capable of supporting long lifespans and slow reproduction. In the post-impact world, none of these were reliably present. Climate still fluctuated, plant communities remained uneven, and energy moved through ecosystems cautiously rather than freely. The planet could sustain life, but it could not yet sustain size. As a result, evolution lingered at smaller scales, shaping a biosphere that favored modest needs and careful living over expansion and dominance. Small bodies came to define this era not as a temporary solution, but as a successful long term strategy. Small animals matured quickly, reproduced often, and required less energy to survive. They could exploit scattered resources, shelter easily, and recover from losses with greater speed. Their limited size allowed them to inhabit a wide range of microenvironments, from forest floors to burrows to early grasslands that had not yet stabilized into rich systems. Movement was efficient, risk was lower, and the consequences of failure were not as absolute. This dominance of small bodies did not result in a chaotic or overcrowded world. Instead, it produced a quiet planet, one where life existed in modest numbers, spread thinly across recovering landscapes. Without giants to consume vast quantities of vegetation or reshape terrain through migration and grazing, ecosystems developed gently. Forests regrew without heavy disturbance. Soils accumulated slowly. The planet breathed at a calmer pace, its biological activity measured and restrained. This quiet, cautious biosphere reflected a deep memory of loss. Evolution does not think or remember, but selection carries the imprint of past conditions forward. Lineages that endured had done so by avoiding excess, conserving energy, and responding carefully to change. These tendencies continued to shape life long after the immediate danger had passed. There was no rush to reclaim grandeur. Even when resources began to increase, the path toward large size remained closed until stability proved itself over long spans of time. The world needed to demonstrate that it could support complexity again before complexity would risk returning. In the meantime, small animals filled roles once occupied by giants, albeit differently. Seed dispersal, predation, and ecosystem engineering occurred on reduced scales, producing landscapes that were functional but subdued. The absence of giants did not create emptiness. It created balance, a state where life operated within limits it could reliably maintain. Over time, this prolonged period without large land animals shaped the direction of future evolution. Traits refined under small body dominance became deeply embedded. Efficiency, flexibility, and behavioral caution defined success. When the conditions that permit gigantism eventually returned, they did so gradually, and size re-emerged slowly, carefully, and selectively. The long delay mattered. It ensured that new giants would arise from lineages already shaped by endurance rather than excess. The world without giants was not a failure or a pause. It was a necessary phase of rebuilding, one in which Earth learned how to support life again without tipping back into vulnerability. In that quiet interval, the planet stabilized its foundations, allowing soil, climate, and ecosystems to knit themselves together once more. Only after this extended calm could size safely return. This chapter in Earth's story reminds us that absence can be as influential as presence. The lack of large animals shaped ecosystems, evolution, and the tempo of recovery in profound ways. The planet did not mourn its giants. It adjusted to their absence, finding a new equilibrium that favored patience over power. In the soft, cautious biosphere that followed, life did not strive to be impressive. It focused on being sustainable, and in doing so, it prepared the ground for a future where size could return not as a relic of the past, but as an expression of a world that had finally become stable enough to hold it again. As the world continued its slow return towards stability, one truth became increasingly clear in the living record left behind. There had been no true beginning after the catastrophe, no moment where life started over cleanly. Instead, a single unbroken thread stretched across the boundary between the world before and the world after, carrying continuity through disaster and into recovery. The lineage that would one day fill the skies did not appear suddenly in the aftermath. It did not rise from empty ground. It persisted quietly and continuously through darkness, scarcity, and silence. Generation followed generation without interruption, even when populations dwindled and habitats fractured. At no point did this line vanish entirely, and at no point did it need to be rebuilt from nothing. Fossils, anatomy, and genetics all echo the same message. Survival flowed forward without a reset, shaped by endurance rather than reinvention. The catastrophe filtered life, but it did not erase this lineage's presence on Earth. This continuity matters because it reframes survival as something far less dramatic than conquest or replacement. There was no triumphant return, no sudden expansion that marked a new beginning. Instead, there was persistence across deep time, the steady passing of traits refined under pressure and carried onward without interruption. Bodies changed slowly, adapting to new opportunities as ecosystems reopened, but the foundation remained intact. Feathers, warm blood, flexible diets, and ground level living did not disappear during the silence. They endured within small populations, maintained by individuals whose daily lives were shaped by careful balance rather than ambition. When conditions improved, these same traits did not need to be invented again. They were already present, ready to support gradual expansion. The lineage did not wait to be called forward by a stable world. It remained present until the world was once again able to support growth. There was no clean restart because evolution does not pause and resume. Even during the quietest periods, life continues to reproduce, compete gently, and persist within narrow margins. The idea of a blank slate belongs to stories, not to biology. What followed the catastrophe was not a new chapter written on empty pages, but a continuation written in smaller, tighter script. Each generation carried memory forward, not as knowledge, but as structure and behavior shaped by what had already worked. The lineage that endured did so without dominance. It did not rule ecosystems or define landscapes for long stretches of time. It existed alongside recovery, woven into it rather than towering over it. Its success lay in staying present when presence itself was difficult to maintain. Survival through persistence rather than dominance also explains why this lineage remained adaptable long after recovery began. Having endured scarcity, it did not depend on abundance. Having survived instability, it did not require perfect conditions. As ecosystems grew richer, these traits did not vanish. They remained part of the lineage's design, providing resilience during later fluctuations and changes. The ability to survive quietly became a foundation upon which later diversity could rest. Over millions of years, forms diversified, sizes changed, behaviors expanded, yet the core approach remained the same. Survival did not come from overwhelming force or specialization alone. It came from continuity, from remaining functional across changing worlds without breaking. Today, that unbroken line still exists, carried in light bodies and quiet movements, in feathers shaped by ancient necessity and behaviors refined under pressure long past. The distance between the deep past and the present is vast, yet the connection remains direct. There was never a moment when this lineage stepped aside or faded into absence. It simply continued, adapting without vanishing, enduring without interruption. In this way, survival becomes something almost gentle. It is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to end, the steady continuation of life through conditions that erase so much else. The line that never broke stands as a reminder that history is not only shaped by extinction and emergence, but by those who remain, quietly carrying the past into the present one generation at a time. By the time the world had settled into its new patterns and life had begun to spread again, the meaning of survival itself stood quietly transformed. Survival was not a victory claimed over catastrophe, not a moment of triumph or dominance secured against odds. It did not arrive with celebration or proof of superiority. It emerged slowly, shaped by absence as much as presence, defined by what had been lost rather than what had been gained. To survive this deep rupture meant continuing despite reduction, carrying on without the fullness that once existed. Many lineages did not rise higher after the catastrophe. They rose thinner. They endured by letting go of excess, by functioning within narrower limits, by accepting a diminished world without exhausting themselves in resistance. Survival became an act of persistence rather than conquest, a quiet agreement with reality rather than a challenge to it. The planet did not reward strength alone. It rewarded restraint, continuity, and the capacity to remain viable while so much else disappeared. Endurance through loss required living without guarantees. Ecosystems rebuilt slowly, often unevenly, and for long stretches offered little beyond basic support. Food webs were shorter, habitats were simpler, population sizes fluctuated gently rather than exploding. To persist under these conditions meant learning to exist without abundance, without constant growth, and without the safety net of a fully restored world. This endurance was cumulative. Each generation that survived without collapse passed forward a structure capable of handling disappointment. Bodies, behaviors, and reproductive strategies reflected this acceptance of instability. The cost of endurance was limitation. The benefit was continuity. Life learned that lasting did not depend on seizing every opportunity, but on avoiding irreversible failure. It became more important not to break than to expand. This logic reshaped evolution itself, favoring designs that remained functional across many conditions instead of excelling in only one. In this quiet filtering, evolution began to favor the unnoticed. Not the largest bodies or the most specialized adaptations, but the forms of life that moved modestly through the world, drawing little attention and demanding little in return. These organisms often left faint traces in the fossil record, their bones small, their populations scattered, their presence easy to overlook, yet they were the ones that carried life forward. They lived close to the ground, fed on what others ignored, sheltered in overlooked spaces, and reproduced steadily without spectacle. Their success was invisible in any single moment, but undeniable across deep time. When conditions shifted again, as they always do, these same traits continued to provide resilience. The unnoticed were not tied to particular climates, landscapes, or ecological hierarchies. They fit anywhere well enough to endure, and that adequacy proved more powerful than perfection. This reframing of survival carries a deeper lesson written into Earth's history. Catastrophe does not simply remove life, it reveals which qualities were quietly aligned with uncertainty all along. Evolution does not chase heroism, it accumulates compatibility. The future belongs not to those that dominate briefly, but to those that remain adaptable when dominance becomes impossible. Survival, in this sense, is not a destination reached after disaster. It is a manner of traveling through time without breaking. The lineages that endured did so without applause, without recognition, and often without flourishing for long stretches. They lived within loss, not beyond it. As the planet continued forward, carrying the memory of that fracture beneath its recovering ecosystems, this logic remained embedded in life itself. Growth returned, diversity expanded, and new forms emerged, but the foundation stayed rooted in endurance. Even in times of abundance, the underlying lesson persisted that survival is not about winning against the world, but fitting within it as it changes. The unnoticed carried that truth forward, shaping the living present from the quiet resilience of the deep past. As the long arc of recovery stretches into the present, the legacy of that ancient catastrophe is no longer hidden only in rock or fossil. It lives around us, light and mobile, threaded through ordinary moments in ways that are easy to overlook. Modern birds are not distant echoes of deep time. They are its continuation, carrying forward a lineage that passed through fire, darkness, scarcity, and silence without breaking. Their anatomy preserves solutions forged under pressure, feathers that once conserved heat now shaping flight, lungs designed for efficient oxygen exchange, and behaviors that balance energy use with caution. Each wingbeat contains a history older than forests as we know them, older than mammals dominating the land. Birds do not represent a new beginning that followed the loss of the dinosaurs. They are the living remainder of a much older story, shaped by survival rather than replacement. When a bird lifts into the air today, it carries with it the structural memory of a world that demanded restraint, flexibility, and endurance long before abundance returned. This legacy is not confined to birds alone. Many everyday animals around us carry traces of that same deep past within their forms and behaviors. Small body sizes, flexible diets, rapid reproduction, and cautious movement patterns are not accidents of modern life. They are inheritances from a time when excess meant failure and simplicity meant survival. The way animals seek shelter, exploit overlooked food sources, or reproduce opportunistically reflects strategies refined when the planet could no longer support waste. Even in stable ecosystems, these traits persist, not as relics, but as safeguards against future uncertainty. Deep time is present not as nostalgia, but as structure. The survival logic of the past remains embedded in living bodies, shaping how they interact with environments that still fluctuate, though far less dramatically than before. Life did not discard the lessons of catastrophe when conditions improved. It carried them forward, layered beneath new adaptations and forms of complexity. The apocalypse that once reshaped the planet has not vanished entirely. It still lingers in the skies, not as threat, but as testimony. Every bird that navigates wind currents, every migration timed to changing seasons, every nest built with economy and care reflects a lineage refined by a world that once withheld sunlight and warmth. The sky, which became a weapon during the collapse, later became a corridor, and now remains a shared space between deep past and present life. Birds move through it with a confidence earned over tens of millions of years, a confidence built not on dominance, but on compatibility with change. Their presence reminds us that survival does not always announce itself with transformation. Sometimes it endures quietly, carrying forward ancient solutions into new contexts without fanfare. The catastrophe did not end when ecosystems recovered. Its influence extended forward, shaping which traits endured and which stories continued to be told through living forms. In recognizing this legacy, the world around us gains depth. A sparrow on a wire, a hawk circling high above, or a seabird gliding low over water are not merely parts of the present moment. They are connections across time, linking our calm skies to an era when the sun failed and life thinned to its most patient forms. The continuity of this lineage shows that Earth's history is not divided neatly into before and after. It is braided, with strands of deep time woven into every living system. The apocalypse remains present, not as destruction, but as memory carried in feathers and bone, in behaviors shaped by loss and persistence. Life did not forget that chapter. It lives with it still, quietly, overhead, every day. Earth has ended before, and it has continued, not by erasing what came before, but by carrying fragments of it forward into quieter futures. The end that closed the age of giants did not leave behind a blank planet waiting for reinvention. It left behind a wounded one, altered in its rhythms, cautious in its generosity, and slow to offer abundance again. Life did not respond with heroism or spectacle. It responded with patience. It reduced its demands, adjusted its expectations, and learned how to exist within narrower margins. The world that followed the catastrophe was not built by triumph, but by endurance through loss. It was shaped by organisms that remained when dominance failed, that functioned without excess, and that persisted when growth was no longer possible. Earth did not reward the loudest survivors. It carried forward the quiet ones, those whose way of living already aligned with uncertainty. Survival, seen through this lens, loses its dramatic edges. It does not resemble victory on a battlefield or conquest over adversity. It looks smaller than that, less visible, and far more humble. It looks like bodies that require little, behaviors that waste nothing, and reproduction that continues even when conditions are poor. It looks like waiting without knowing how long, adapting without guarantees, and remaining functional when flourishing is impossible. The survivors of the ancient collapse did not reclaim the world quickly. They lived within it carefully, letting stability return at its own pace. In doing so, they preserved continuity, ensuring that life did not break even when the world itself nearly did. This kind of survival leaves few monuments. Its evidence is subtle, written into traits, habits, and structures that still exist today, not as memories of catastrophe, but as tools refined by it. What the broken planet left behind is not a warning carved in stone, but a lesson carried in living form. Life endures not by being invincible, but by being compatible with change. It persists by remaining flexible when systems fail and by valuing continuity over expansion. The past shows that collapse does not always mean an ending. Sometimes it is a narrowing, a reduction to what truly works, followed by a slow opening toward new possibilities. The living world around us still carries that lesson. Birds moving quietly through the air, small animals sheltering close to the ground, and ecosystems that recover slowly after disturbance all reflect a deep history of restraint and patience. The planet continues not because it avoids ending, but because life learns how to continue afterward. As this long story settles, it invites a softer kind of reflection. The end of a world does not require noise or spectacle. It can arrive as dimming light, thinning life, and long silence. And the continuation that follows does not announce itself loudly either. It begins with what remains. If this journey through Earth's deep past has felt calm rather than dramatic, that is fitting. The most important stories the planet tells are not always the ones about domination or disaster. They are about persistence, about the quiet refusal to vanish, and about the small, patient ways life carries itself forward through time. If you feel inclined, take a moment to sit with that idea, to let it linger as part of your own evening reflection. You are welcome to share what stood out to you, to add your voice to this long conversation across deep history, and to continue exploring the slow, fascinating stories our planet has been telling for billions of years.